I need to see your papers. Are you a U.S. citizen?
Yep, born in Chicago.
What's this about? I'm asking a simple legal question. What's my violation? What have I done wrong?
Just show me the goddamn papers.
The question he asked was the simplest possible. He wanted to know what his violation was. He wanted to know what he had done wrong. It was not an aggressive question or a provocation. It was the direct question of a man who had spent decades of his life serving a country that was now, in a parking lot on a sunny day, demanding that he prove he had the right to exist in it. The agent in front of him did not answer immediately. The second agent in the tactical vest stood in the background watching, and the body camera that had begun recording before any word was spoken captured every second of that scene with the precise indifference of a device that does not know what it is documenting but would document anyway, because that is what cameras do. What that camera had documented in that parking lot that day would be enough to change everything that came after. The man standing in that parking lot with that question in the air had served in Vietnam. He had been deployed at 18, had spent 14 months in a theater of operations that produced in a specific number of people who experienced it a kind of memory that does not dissolve with time, but integrates in ways that each person who carries it manages as best they can. He had come home with honors, had rebuilt a life with the determination of someone who learned that rebuilding is what you do when what existed before can no longer be recovered, and had reached 68 years of age with the kind of presence that decades of experience produce in people who pay attention to what life teaches. There was in that posture, even in the adversity of that parking lot, something the camera captured, but that no camera can fully capture. The specific dignity of someone who knows who they are, regardless of what anyone else in that moment is saying or doing. The agents who had approached him in that parking lot belonged to an immigration and customs enforcement unit operating in that region of the state. They had arrived in 2 cars, had positioned themselves in a way the body camera captured as the tactical configuration of a planned operation and not a casual encounter, and had approached the man while he was in the parking lot with a list of items he had purchased at the store beside it still in his hand. There were eggs in the bag. There was bread. There was the kind of purchase a person makes when stocking the kitchen for an ordinary week. And there were 2 federal agents asking him to prove who he was, because his appearance had led someone to a conclusion about his citizenship that the reality of his history disproved with a completeness that would be documented in detail in the weeks that followed. The man's name was Leonard. He was 68 years old, had been born in the state where he was now standing in that parking lot, had received his Vietnam draft notice at 18, like any other American citizen of his generation who had reached that age at that specific historical moment, and had served with a distinction recorded in military documents that existed in a federal archive that any government agency could access, with a query that would take less time than the interaction happening in that parking lot. After military service, he had worked for 32 years at a distribution company, had retired with the pension that work had produced, and had spent the subsequent years in a routine that included the grocery store every Thursday morning, because Thursday was the day the sales changed, and Leonard had developed over decades the kind of domestic efficiency that comes from paying attention to details most people do not think are worth attention. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. This story has a specific layer that separates it from other cases this channel has examined, because what the ICE agents did in that parking lot did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the context of a specific policy, in an operation with defined targets, and the questions it raised went beyond that parking lot and that day. Hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments. Can you imagine being a war veteran and having to prove citizenship to government agents in your own country? Tell me down below. The body camera had captured Leonard's question with a clarity that made any argument about what had been said impossible. 4 words that were also 4 questions. What was the violation? What had he done wrong? The agent in front of him had responded with language the camera had recorded, and that Leonard's attorneys would analyze repeatedly in the weeks that followed. Language that avoided answering the question while creating the appearance of responding, that used terms like routine verification and operational protocol to substitute for the answer that did not exist, because there was no answer that held up. Leonard had listened to that language with the expression the camera captured as the expression of someone who recognizes when a non-answer is being packaged in words that sound like an answer. He had served in an army that used that kind of language. He knew the difference between communication and cover. And the question he had asked, what was the violation, what had he done wrong, remained in the air unanswered, because the true answer was that there was no violation and nothing wrong beyond the conclusion someone had formed about who he was before verifying any fact. Leonard had arrived at that grocery store parking lot at 10:17 on that Thursday morning, as he had done on practically every Thursday for the past 6 years since he had retired and established the routine that retirement allows when you no longer need to organize time around an external schedule. He had parked the truck in the same spot he usually parked, had taken the list he had written the night before on a notebook page that he folded and placed in his shirt pocket, and had done the shopping with the methodical precision of someone who knows every aisle of that specific store and knows exactly where each item is without needing to search. He had spent 23 minutes inside the store, had paid at the register with the same employee who served him frequently enough to recognize him by name, and had come out through the automatic doors with 2 bags and the list crossed out entirely because he had found everything he had planned to find. The agents had arrived at the parking lot some minutes before Leonard came out of the store. There were 2 unmarked vehicles positioned in ways that the body camera one of them was carrying had begun recording before Leonard appeared through the automatic doors. This was visible in the recording, and was a detail that Leonard's attorneys would identify as relevant. The agents were positioned and recording before Leonard came out, which meant the approach had not been the result of spontaneous observation of behavior in the parking lot, but had been planned before Leonard appeared, which raised a question that would be central to the lawsuit, the question of how Leonard had been identified as a target before he was in the parking lot, and what had underpinned that identification. The agent who had made the initial approach was named, according to records that would be obtained during the discovery process, Supervisory Agent Daniel Walsh. Walsh had approached Leonard shortly after he came out through the automatic doors with the bags, had identified himself as an ICE agent, and had asked for identity documentation. Leonard had stopped, had looked at the agent, and had asked that question the camera captured, and that would become the most shared caption of the video when it reached the public. He had asked what his violation was, what he had done wrong. Walsh had responded that it was a routine verification and that he needed to see a document. Leonard had said he was American, that he had been born in that state, and had asked whether there was any law that required an American citizen to carry proof of citizenship to do grocery shopping. That question had hung in the air for a moment before Walsh responded that he just needed to verify identity and that it would be quick. What Leonard had been carrying in his wallet that day was what most people carry in an ordinary wallet: his driver's license, some cards, a health insurance card, and a veteran's military service card he had carried since receiving it. After military service 50 years earlier, and that had become so integrated a part of that wallet's contents that Leonard sometimes forgot it was there, until a situation like that, one made it the most relevant object of everything he possessed. He had removed the wallet from his pocket, had shown the driver's license first because that was what most people showed when someone asked for identification, and Walsh had examined the document for a moment before saying he needed something that confirmed citizenship status. Leonard had looked at the agent with that expression the camera captured and had removed the veteran's card from the wallet. The veteran's card had been examined by Walsh with the second agent who had approached during that time. The two had exchanged a few words in low voices that the camera's audio had captured with insufficient clarity for transcription, but with enough to establish that an exchange was occurring. Walsh had then told Leonard he needed to verify the information in the system and that it would take a few minutes. Leonard had asked whether he was being detained. Walsh had said no, that it was a voluntary verification. Leonard had responded with the precision of someone who knows the difference between the legal categories Walsh was using, had said that if it was voluntary, then he was ending his cooperation and continuing with his day. Walsh had said it would be better for Leonard to cooperate. That phrase, that it would be better for Leonard to cooperate, had been captured by the camera with enough clarity to be transcribed, and was the phrase Leonard's attorneys would later describe as the moment of voluntary verification had become implicitly coercive, because the suggestion that it would be better to cooperate in an interaction the agent had just described as voluntary created a pressure that made the voluntary character of the interaction a fiction. Leonard had stayed in the parking lot, not because he had agreed that it was better to cooperate in the way Walsh had suggested, but because he had made a calculation that any black man of his generation would understand without need for explanation. There were two armed federal agents in a parking lot on an empty weekday morning. There was a camera recording. And there were decades of experience that taught that the difference between a situation that resolves without incident and a situation that resolves otherwise frequently depended on decisions made in the first minutes about how to respond to what was being done. Leonard had stayed, had kept the bags in his hand, and had continued asking questions with that direct precision of someone who knows that every question and every answer is being recorded and that it matters, even when it is not yet possible to know exactly in what way it will matter. The system verification had taken 17 minutes. 17 minutes during which Leonard had stood in the parking lot with the grocery bags in his hand in the sun of a summer morning, while Walsh operated a tablet and the second agent remained positioned a few meters away in a configuration the camera captured with enough clarity that anyone watching would understand. There was nothing voluntary about Leonard's presence in that parking lot, regardless of the language Walsh had used to describe it. Other store customers had passed through the parking lot during those 17 minutes, some glancing briefly toward the scene, others looking away with the kind of artificial hurry people develop when they see something that discomforts them, but that they do not know how to process. None had stopped, none had asked anything. The scene had happened with the specific invisibility of things that occur in broad daylight, but that context makes difficult to intervene in. During those 17 minutes, Leonard had asked 3 more questions the camera had captured. He had asked Walsh's full name and the agent identification number, information Walsh had provided after a hesitation the audio had recorded as a pause of perhaps 4 seconds before the response. He had asked on what legal basis the verification was being conducted, specifically which statute or regulation authorized ICE agents to approach American citizens in grocery store parking lots and demand proof of citizenship without any specific probable cause. Walsh had responded with a reference to general operational authority that had cited no specific statute and that Leonard had immediately identified as a non-answer, saying he had asked for the legal basis and not a description of the agency's general authority. He had also asked whether Walsh's supervisor was available to be contacted at that moment. Walsh had said he was the supervisor in the field on that operation. The verification result had arrived on Walsh's tablet 17 minutes after Leonard had been approached. The camera had captured Walsh looking at the tablet, had captured the expression that crossed his face at that moment, and had captured what he said next, which was the kind of sentence that reveals, by the way it is constructed, that the person saying it understands there is a problem with what was being done, but is not yet ready to name that problem directly. Walsh had said that Leonard's information had been verified and that he was free to continue his day. He had not apologized, had not explained what the verification had found, had not acknowledged any inadequacy in the approach. He had simply declared that Leonard was free, as though the freedom of a 68-year-old man to do grocery shopping in the city where he was born were something that needed to be declared by a federal agent after 17 minutes of verification. Leonard had stood still for a moment after hearing that. The camera had captured that moment with the detail cameras capture when something is happening that has no movement but has weight. Then he had said something Walsh had clearly not expected and that the camera had recorded with enough clarity to be transcribed word for word. He had said he wanted Walsh's full name again, the operation number being conducted, the second agent's identification number, and the location of the ICE office responsible for that operation, because he had served in that country for 14 months in Vietnam, and was not going to go home and forget what had happened in that parking lot as though it had not happened. Walsh had provided the information with that same 4-second hesitation that had characterized the first time his identification number had been requested. And Leonard had retained everything mentally with the precision of someone who had learned decades earlier that information retained at the right moment is frequently the only protection available. What the verification had found, and that would become public during the discovery process of the subsequent lawsuit, was that Leonard did not appear in any ICE record as an investigation target. There was no deportation order associated with his name. There was no ongoing immigration status verification process related to him, and that the Social Security number associated with his name identified him unambiguously as an American citizen born in that state with decades of documented tax, Social Security, and military service records in federal archives that any government agency could access. The verification had confirmed in 17 minutes that Leonard was exactly who he had said he was from the first second of the interaction. What it had not explained, and what the lawsuit would attempt to establish with the precision the available evidence permitted, was why that verification had been necessary in the first place. What had placed Leonard on an approach list for an ICE operation in a grocery store, parking lot in an American city on a Thursday morning? There was an answer to that question that emerged from documentation obtained during the discovery process, and that was simpler and more disturbing than any complex operational explanation could be. The operation Walsh was part of had been conducted in that specific neighborhood, based on a profile that internal documents described as identification of individuals with phenotypic characteristics consistent with undocumented populations of Latin American origin. Leonard had no Latin American origin. There was nothing in his history, his appearance, his behavior, or any other observable characteristic that connected him to that profile beyond one characteristic. The documents did not mention explicitly, but that the sequence of events made inferable with a clarity that Leonard's attorneys would describe as the best documented inference they had constructed in a case in many years of practice. Leonard had been approached because he was black, because he was in a neighborhood where the operation was active, and because someone had made a decision about who he might be before verifying any fact about who he was. Leonard had arrived home that Thursday with the grocery bags and with something more he had brought from that store's parking lot. The absolute clarity that what had happened that morning was not something a complaint call to a general customer service number would resolve. He had put the groceries away with his usual meticulousness, had placed the eggs in the refrigerator, had folded the bags and stored them in the drawer where he kept bags because Leonard was the kind of person who reused bags, and then had sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and had begun writing. He had written the names he had memorized in the parking lot, Walsh and the identification number, and the second agent's number, and the description of the tablet and the exact time he had noted when Walsh had arrived, and the approximate time at which he had been released. He had written all of this in the organized handwriting of someone who had learned decades earlier, in military service, that precise records save, lives in contexts where the official version of events can diverge from what actually happened. The call he had made that afternoon had not been to any complaint line or to any elected representative. It had been to a man named Gerald, who had served with Leonard in Vietnam, who had returned to the same city, and who had spent the last 20 years working as a paralegal at a civil law firm after completing law school at 52, with the specific determination of someone who decides late that they need tools they did not have. Gerald had listened to the complete account without interruption, had asked 3 questions at the end, had said that Leonard needed an attorney specializing in 2 fields simultaneously, civil rights and federal litigation against government agencies, and that he knew exactly the right person. He had also said that Leonard needed to do one thing before anything else: formally request the body camera recording of the agents present in the parking lot before the mandatory preservation deadline expired. Leonard had asked what that deadline was. Gerald had said it varied by agency and jurisdiction, and that the safest answer was to act as if it were tomorrow. The formal request had been sent the following day, drafted with Gerald's assistance and addressed to the ICE office responsible for the operation, with a copy to the Inspector General's Office of the Department of Homeland Security. That copy to the Inspector General had been a strategic decision that the attorney who would take on the case 2 weeks later would describe as one of the most intelligent he had seen a client make before having legal representation, because it had created a record that the request had reached a supervisory level that made any subsequent loss of the material much more difficult to treat as accident or technical failure. The request had identified the agents by name and identification number that Leonard had memorized, had specified the time and location of the incident, had described the requested material with enough precision that there was no ambiguity about what was being asked, and had established that the material was needed as evidence in connection with a formal complaint about federal agent conduct that was being prepared. The attorney who took on the case was named Victor Reyes, had 46 years of federal litigation experience, and had conducted lawsuits against government agencies with enough frequency to have developed the kind of mental map of those agencies' defense mechanisms that only builds through years of repeated encounters with the same tactics in different contexts. When he had watched the recording for the first time, he had been silent for a few minutes after the video ended before speaking. He had said there were 2 elements in that video that, individually, would support a solid lawsuit. Together, he had said, They created something that, in his words, was difficult to defend by any attorney who needed to make that defense while looking at that video at the same time as looking at a jury. The first element was Leonard's question. What was the violation? What had he done wrong? And the absence of any answer that held up. The second was the veteran's card, which had been examined by the agents and that established with an absolutely devastating symbolic economy that the man they were treating as a suspect of illegal presence in a country had served that country with weapons in hand, while many of his contemporaries had found ways not to do that. The lawsuit had been filed in federal court with allegations covering 4 distinct categories. The first was unlawful detention because the interaction had been described as voluntary by Walsh, but had been conducted in a way that made Leonard's departure implicitly impossible without the consequences that the suggestion it would be better to cooperate had communicated. The second was racial discrimination by a federal agent, grounded in documentation obtained during the discovery process that had revealed the operation's profile and the absence of any criterion beyond physical appearance that could explain Leonard's approach. The third was violation of Fourth Amendment constitutional rights because the verification had occurred without established probable cause and without any genuine consent that the coercive context of the interaction could have produced. And the fourth, which had been the most debated internally before being included, was specific harm to a war veteran whose identity as an American citizen had been questioned by agents of the government he had served, an allegation that had no direct precedent in jurisprudence, but that Victor had argued with sufficient theoretical basis to be included as an alternative the court could consider independently of the other 3. The agency had responded to the lawsuit with the kind of response that government agencies produce when they need to defend actions that available evidence makes difficult to defend. They had invoked operational discretion, had argued that Walsh had acted within the limits of his authority as a federal agent, and had attempted to frame the interaction as the result of a good faith error in an operation with legitimate objectives. That line of defense had collapsed in distinct phases as the discovery process had revealed the operation's internal documents, the profile criteria used, and the history of approaches the operation had conducted in that neighborhood in the weeks before and after the incident with Leonard, a history that had shown a pattern that made the characterization of an isolated good faith error progressively impossible to maintain, with documentary evidence pointing in the opposite direction. The operation's internal documents obtained during the discovery process told a story that was more detailed and more problematic than any narrative the agency had publicly produced about the incident with Leonard. The operation had been authorized 6 weeks before the day Leonard had left the store with his grocery bags, had been designated with an internal code the documents used consistently, but that Leonard's attorneys had identified as irrelevant to the lawsuit, and had been described in the authorization documents as an enforcement initiative focused on geographic areas with high concentrations of undocumented populations of Central American and South American origin. That geographic and demographic description had been the basis on which agents had been instructed to identify approach targets, and the training documents associated with the operation had described the identification criteria in a way that specialists consulted by Leonard's attorneys had evaluated as functionally equivalent to racial profiling authorization, because the observable criteria agents had been instructed to use in identifying targets were phenotypic criteria that any honest analysis would recognize as proxies for race and ethnicity and not as objective indicators of immigration status. Walsh had been deposed 6 weeks after the filing of the lawsuit. The deposition had lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes and had been conducted by Victor with a methodology that observers present described as the methodology of someone who had prepared each question with full knowledge of what the most likely answer would be and how each answer related to the body of documentary evidence already in Leonard's attorney's possession. Walsh had responded with the consistency of someone who had been prepared by the agency's legal team, but had encountered an obstacle that legal preparation can never completely eliminate when documentary evidence is sufficiently specific. There were moments when the answer preparation suggested and the answer the documents made defensible were different answers, and at those moments the testimony had produced inconsistencies that Victor had documented with precision and that had become a central part of the evidence archive. The most revealing question of the deposition had occurred in the 3rd hour, when Victor had asked Walsh to describe the specific criterion that had motivated the approach to Leonard in that parking lot. Walsh had said he had observed behavior consistent with the operation's profile. Victor had asked him to describe that behavior specifically. Walsh had said that Leonard had been standing in the parking lot for a time, that had seemed inconsistent with someone who had done grocery shopping. Victor had then presented the store's point-of-sale system, records showing the exact time Leonard had paid and left, and had calculated out loud the time between Leonard's exit through the checkout and Walsh's approach, which had been approximately 90 seconds. He had asked whether Walsh considered that 90 seconds between leaving a store and being approached by federal agents who had already been positioned in the parking lot before Leonard's exit constituted a time inconsistent with someone who had done grocery shopping. Walsh had been silent for perhaps 8 seconds before responding that there were other factors. Victor had asked him to list those other factors. Walsh had listed 2 that the operations documents contradicted and had fallen silent after the second. The video had reached the public during that period, not through any deliberate strategy of Leonard's attorneys, but through a process that had begun when a journalist covering EACE had obtained information about the lawsuit's existence and had requested access to the case's public records, which included references to the body camera that by that point had already been preserved and transferred to Leonard's attorney's control through the appropriate legal mechanisms. The recording had been described in enough detail in an initial article that demand for the complete video became immediate and intense. When the video had eventually been made available as part of the case's public records, it had accumulated more than 12 million views in 72 hours, a number that had surprised even the platforms where it had circulated, and that had transformed Leonard's case into a reference point in discussions about ICE practices that had been occurring in policy circles, but that the video had brought to a dramatically wider audience. The public reaction had created pressure on the agency that had operated in parallel with the legal pressure and had interacted with it in ways that legal strategists on both sides had attempted to calculate with limited precision, because that kind of interaction between public pressure and legal process rarely follows predictable models. Veterans organizations had issued statements that had been particularly effective in terms of media coverage because they had combined the language of service and sacrifice with a specific criticism of the agency that was difficult to dismiss with the framings the agency normally used to respond to criticism of its practices. Elected representatives had called for investigations. The Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security had opened an independent review of the operation that had been conducted in that neighborhood, a review that had occurred in parallel with Leonard's lawsuit, but that had been initiated by the copy of the evidence preservation request that Gerald had advised Leonard to send on that second day after the incident. Walsh had been removed from field duties during the Inspector General's review, in a decision the agency had announced without explicitly connecting it to Leonard's lawsuit, but that occurred on a timeline that made any other causal connection impossible to construct credibly. The second agent had received an administrative assignment while the review was ongoing, and the entire operation had been suspended 4 weeks after the video had become public, in a decision the agency had described as protocol review, but that internal documents obtained during the discovery process would later show had been precipitated by the Inspector General's review's preliminary conclusion that the profiling criteria used in the operation were not defensible under federal anti-discrimination legislation applicable to immigration enforcement activities in American territory with a citizen population. The agreement was signed 11 months after that Thursday morning in the parking lot. Victor had conducted the negotiations with the specific patience of someone who knows that time is not working in the opposing party's favor, and that each additional week without resolution is a week in which the operation's internal documents remain as public record of the process, and in which the recording continues accumulating views and references in discussions about immigration policy that the agency would prefer not to be feeding. The agency had made 3 offers before the final agreement, each revealing through the amount offered the assessment it had made of the risk of going to trial with that body camera as central evidence and with the operation's profiling documents as established context. The first offer had been rejected by Victor without immediate counteroffer, with a note explaining that the amount demonstrated the agency had not yet made the correct assessment of what was at stake. The second had produced a counteroffer. The third had produced the agreement. The financial amount of the agreement remained partially confidential by negotiated clause, but sources familiar with the process confirmed it was among the largest ever paid by the agency in an individual civil rights violation case. and that there was an additional component that was not part of the principal amount, but had been included as a separate condition. The agency had agreed to pay the mental health treatment costs Leonard might require in connection with the documented effects of the incident, without value limit and without expiration date, a condition Victor had included in the negotiations after Leonard had described in one of their preparatory meetings what he had experienced in the weeks after the parking lot. The nights he had woken with the physical clarity of being back in that space with the bags in his hand and the agents around him, the specific difficulty of a man who had survived Vietnam and who had built decades of life after that, processing that the government of that country had questioned his right to exist in it in a grocery store parking lot on an ordinary morning. The institutional conditions of the agreement had been the longest to negotiate and had been the ones Leonard had defended most firmly in every meeting with Victor about what was and was not negotiable. The operation that had produced the incident had been permanently closed, not suspended for a fixed period but closed, with formal closure documentation that had been included as an annex to the agreement and that existed as a verifiable record independently of any subsequent public statement by the agency. The profiling criteria that had been used in the operation had been formally designated as non-conforming with agency policy, a designation that had been inserted in the operations manual with specific language that made any future operation using similar criteria a documentable violation of internal policy beyond any external legal violation. Walsh had been dismissed as a condition of the agreement, with permanent notation in the employment record. The second agent had received a 6-month suspension without pay and had been required to complete a training program on the constitutional rights of American citizens in immigration enforcement operations. The condition that had been most contested in the negotiations, and that Leonard had told Victor, was the one he would not concede regardless of the impact on the financial amount, was the condition on specific veteran training. Leonard had demanded that the agency implement, as part of the agreement, a mandatory protocol that identified American Armed Forces veteran status as a factor that should be verified immediately in any citizenship verification approach, with a direct access mechanism to the Department of Veterans Affairs database that permitted real-time verification. That condition had met agency. Resistance that had argued operational complexity and interoperability issues between different agencies' systems. Leonard had told Victor, in one of the meetings where this had been discussed, that operational complexity was the argument of people who had not spent 14 months in Vietnam, and that interoperability between federal agency systems was a problem the American government had demonstrated it was capable of solving when it had decided the problem merited a solution. The protocol had been included in the agreement. The Inspector General's review had concluded independently of Leonard's lawsuit, although the two processes had shared evidence through the appropriate legal mechanisms that the operation had violated internal Department of Homeland Security guidelines on permissible target identification criteria in enforcement operations on American territory. That conclusion had been made public in a report that had cited Leonard's case, with his name as a central example, of the operational failure that had been identified, and had recommended systemic changes that went beyond the conditions of the individual agreement, and that had created a second level of pressure on the agency to implement changes the Leonard Agreement had established, but that the Inspector General's report had validated with the authority of an independent federal investigation. Leonard had given an interview after the agreement was signed, the only one he had granted throughout the entire process, to a journalist who had covered the case since the initial article that had described the recording. The interview had lasted 40 minutes and had been published at a length the journalist had justified to the editor by saying there were some stories that aggressive editing diminished rather than improved. Leonard had spoken about Vietnam with the economy of words of someone who had reached the conclusion that some experiences are not explainable but can be referenced. He had spoken about the 32 years of work and about retirement and about Thursdays at the grocery store with that folded list in his shirt pocket. He had spoken about the notebook where he had written the names and numbers that Thursday afternoon after putting away the groceries. And he had said, near the end of the interview, something the journalist had placed as the last sentence of the article because he had immediately recognized it was the sentence that contained everything the article had tried to say in the 42 preceding paragraphs. Leonard had said he had served that country because he had believed in what it represented and that the process he had conducted had not been to prove he had served, because that was already proven in military documents that had existed for 50 years, but to demand that the country act in accordance with what it represented rather than merely representing it. He had paused after saying that. Then he had said he would return to the grocery store the following Thursday, that there were eggs on the list,